Hello, I'm APXToyCat and welcome back to the second channel video. Today I want to answer a very big question, and that question is why flying in Europe is so cheap. This is something I'll occasionally remember whenever someone from the US, hears me say oh yeah, my flight from Basel to London was just under £20, or oh, I flew from London to Denmark, last year for just £6. People are always curious when I say these things as to how flying is that, ludicrously cheap, what crazy hacking tools I'm pulling off to make that happen, but truth be told, flying in Europe is just generally very cheap, although those are, lower cost outliers, generally speaking, like a €30 flight from one place to the other is a very standard fare. However, I looked up the average cost of a round-trip flight in the US, that's starting in the US and ending there, a domestic flight, and it was $509 for a round-trip flight as of 2012, which is an order of magnitude larger than the numbers I was just describing, and you might be curious as to exactly why that is. Why is flying in the US so much more expensive than flying in Europe? And again, that's what I'm tackling with today's video. Hopefully you'll enjoy it with this slightly different new format thing. So yeah, with that said, let's get straight into it, and let's start by talking about, I guess, why the US is so bad and non-conducive to, I guess, high competition, low-cost fare airports, low-cost fare flying, I should say, because basically the first point is to do with those airports, because the cost of these bigger, better airports, so bear in mind in the US, each city generally has fewer airports, and those airports are bigger. The cost of these airports is therefore higher as a result, because they can charge higher things, and there's less competition in the airport side of things, even though the airline industry has been deregulated for a while, so any airline can start up and do stuff. Truth be told, the airports themselves can charge these giant fees, and what are you really going to do about it? So on top of the fact that these airports have these larger fees, because they are large airports, and they are quote-unquote better airports, they serve the local population better than certain European airports, and so on and so forth, this means there's not really too much choice as to a lot of the cost of the, airline ticket. And in fact, if you look at most tickets, even though if it will cost you $100, the lion's share of that will be fees from the airports and taxes and various things like that from the government, because as well as charging a tax just for any plane, departing or landing, there is also a bunch of charges from the government themselves just to handle, stuff like the TSA, to handle stuff like the immigrations, the customs, all that sort of stuff is actually, paid for by the customer themselves as a part of the airline ticket. So when you add all of those factors together, you actually get a really significant chunk of the bill just right there, just because the airports charge a lot more, and then the government is also tacking on a lot of fees onto those airport charges, and it all kind of together means that, yeah, the cost of bigger airports is very significant, and there isn't really much competition within each city. Most cities in America have a lot fewer airports than most cities in Europe. If you take like London, which has 6, and you take Paris, which has several, you take all these giant cities with lots of different airports. In the US, even the, one of the cities which contains the 6th largest airport, O'Hare International, Chicago, only has 2 airports. There's a lot of, really significant cities that only have 1 airport still, such as Austin, such as Charlotte, such as Portland, and no matter what those, airports charge, unless it's ludicrously high and you literally can't afford it, you're going to just have to pay it and fly there anyway. So yeah, lack of competition amongst airports, and generally, in lots of cases, there is just 1 airport per city, so there's less kind of motivation of any kind of negotiating with the airlines, because guess what, they have to pay the fee if they want to fly there, and that's a big, again, it's a kind of brick wall in the cost that the consumer ends up paying in the end. However, that doesn't explain all of it, so the airports charge more, and that makes it go from, a £6 flight to $500. I think we're missing something here, Toycat, and you would be correct to assume that, and because another really significant part of the cost is the hub and spoke method used by most US airlines. So whether this is necessary or whether it's just some, part holding back the US is kind of hard to debate about, because the US has the most airports in the world of any country, or landing strips over a certain number of distance, but it has the most airports in the world, which means connecting all of those up, point to point, would be impossible. So the system they use instead is the hub and spoke method, where there are several significant hubs, and then the airlines all fly into these hubs, and then you can fly from any, one point into the hub, and then out from the other, the hub, out into another point. So if you wanted to fly from, let's say, Portland, Oregon into Miami, Florida, then you would not be able to fly directly from one of those airports to the other ones. Instead, because most airlines use the hub and spoke, you would fly somewhere in between the two, somewhere in the center of the US, and then you fly out from there to Miami. So in this particular case, I believe it would be Dallas, Fort Worth, it might be Houston, it might even be like Chicago, but you have to fly into some other major hub airport first to get from one airport to the other. And although this sounds like it's terrible on the surface because connecting flights, the truth be told, it revolutionized the air industry in America at first, because it meant that you could fly from anywhere to anywhere else a lot easier and without, several stages of connections, because as long as you had 1 or 2 big hubs, then every flight could connect into there, and it meant that every flight was connected to another flight by just 1 change. However, the downside to this, and the reason the point-to-point model is more popular, is because this means that there is a change, and you have to give people 2 flights, essentially, for the price of 1, because if you're selling a ticket from Portland to Miami, that is 2 separate tickets there. You have to, do all the baggage changing, you're paying the airport charges twice, you're doing all these separate things, basically, just to create the same ticket, which you're then usually trying to sell for less, because a ticket with changes is less desirable than one without, and you're basically doubling if not more, than doubling the cost of your ticket while trying to sell it for less because it's an inferior product. And again, this hub and spoke method is massively widespread in the United States, whereas it's not quite so prevalent in Europe, which we'll get to in a second. But there's the hub and spoke method then, which then leads to 2 flights being sold for the price of 1 and all this extra stuff on top of all those other factors. But then the big things are the fact that it's kind of going down to historical facts, because basically airline fares used to be regulated within the United States. So this stopped being done a long time ago. But back when airline fares were regulated, you would have to pay a fixed price from New York to Los Angeles, and that was set by the government. So obviously this is a bad thing, because it means competition can't truly thrive at that point on price, which is the key factor in flying. So the way they competed instead is they competed by having better services than the other ones. So if you wanted to compete having your airline be better, you'd have to instead try and sell on the quality of your service, the extra perks you offered, and all this sort of stuff. And this is why, by the way, even today, where people care mostly about the fares, airlines still have that sort of stuff in there, because it's just a legacy factor that if you remove, you're just going to upset a lot of existing customers while probably not gaining too many new ones. It's a very tricky place a lot of airlines find themselves in, and this kind of describes the vast majority of the US market. They have a lot of these built-in features which add even more to the cost, and one of the biggest ones of these is actually to do with the cost of staff, because pensions, it's hard to find exact figures because it varies so much from airline to airline, but by a lot of measures they're up to 40% of the airline's cost of staffing. And because obviously, again, when they were trying to get more pilots in, you would sell them by having a really good pension scheme, and this increases massively the costs of your cost per flight, which you can actually control, which means that on top of all these fixed fees which are uncontrollable, on top of the way they're actually flying them from airport to airport, there is the fact that these airlines have to pay their staff more because of either unionization or pension or all these different factors which are almost impossible to properly mitigate. So they're the big kind of factors, but the other ones that make it even worse and kind of pile on that even more are the fact that budget airlines are truly seen as pretty terrible in the United States, because they have an extra tier of airline, and that is the ultra low cost carrier. So instead of just having the full service planes where you get food, you get alcohol, all that sort of stuff included, and as well as having the low cost carrier where that's like just down to the bare bones, there's also what's known as the ultra low cost carrier in the United States, which is what you would describe Spirit Airlines as, and Frontier, if you've heard of those. And basically they as well as just trying to do as cheap fares as humanly possible, they try to get a lot of, I guess, like kind of trick mechanisms in there. So they charge you for cabin baggage, even though there's no extra charge for them, just because they can. There's all these additional costs, and I really don't like them. I don't know if you can tell. There's all these extra costs they impose that give the low cost carrier a really, really bad name in the United States. So yeah, people don't like to fly the low cost airlines, and they kind of see budget airlines as being a trick regardless, because to some extent they actually are. And then you combine that, the lack of interest in these low cost airlines, and therefore the lower fares that can be achieved through like high competition, with the fact that interest in flying in general is just a lot lower in the United States. So there's lots of factors you can pin this on. There's just again, it's growing a lot less quickly than other places. But there's 9/11, a very big event in the United States' history, not quite as big a deal elsewhere. There is the fact that the TSA is it's significantly worse than airport security elsewhere, and also the fact that in the United States, on average, 24% of flights are delayed for an average delay of 1 hour and 54 minutes. So you have these longer flights which have to take these stops, and then you have a 24% chance of being delayed. And not only is that 24% chance, that 24% chance goes significantly up when you go to the very big hubs from before that you're statistically likely to be at, because at JFK only 63% of flights are actually on time, and at O'Hare Airport, the 6th largest airport in the United States, it is just a 66% on time record, which means 34% of planes are not on time in some way, and the average delay off that is almost 2 hours. Then you can kind of see why that kind of is a terrible situation and why the US air market is pretty dire. So what is the European advantage? Because you might assume from the very basics that flying from European country to European country must suck, because there are lots of different countries. There's got to be a billion rules you got to follow. It must be terrible because something regulation. However, the truth is there is actually an open skies within the European Union. There is a EU single flying market, which means any EU country can fly to any other EU country because it's one giant market to some extent. And this actually extends beyond the EU to the EFTA countries too. So Norway and Switzerland are also involved, which means that any airline, so let's take Ryanair. Ryanair is the most well-known low-cost carrier in the world, perhaps. They are an Irish-based carrier, despite having most of their flights go out of London, Paris, and other cities in Germany. And this is because, there is a single EU market, and this means that the airlines which are doing the biggest job in reducing the fares, they can operate all over the place. So even though there are just 3 or 4 of them across all of Europe, at least 3 or 4 giant ones, I should say. In the case of Ryanair, which is Irish-based, there is EasyJet, which is British-based, and there's also Wizz Air, which is Hungarian, if I'm not mistaken. You have all of these, different airlines from all different places, places, but they can serve any airport they want within any different place. So yeah, it's kind of a single market in that point, and that's the big, like, shouldn't that be terrible kind of sorted. So that's the big reason why it kind of functions a bit similar. But you might then say, well, that's just putting it on par with the US. Why is it then 10 times cheaper despite, just being on the same level? There's surely got to be something else different. And yeah, there is something else different. And the first one here is actually competition with rail. So basically, in the European Union, or just Europe as a whole, there's kind of a lot of overlap between the two. So whatever, we'll just assume the same two terms here. But yeah, in the European Union, rail travel is significant as a competition to air. So the big example is the London to Paris route when they built the Channel Tunnel. A high-speed rail route directly between the United Kingdom's capital, London, and France's capital, Paris. When they built that tunnel, it actually dominated the route between those two countries. And now it is the case where if you take all the airlines combined and you put them against the single operator on that route, Eurostar, is still the train takes up most of the traffic because it's more convenient to take the train in that case. So high-speed rail is a significant competitor to flying in a lot of these big routes. If you want to go from Paris to Frankfurt, there is a high-speed train there. If you want to go from Madrid to Barcelona, even, there are high-speed rail connections which are faster, or at the very least the same speed, or faster once you consider that it's city to city than taking the plane. And there's even one being built right now across the EU from Paris to Bratislava in Slovakia. There are all these crazy high-speed rail routes which are kind of significant competitors. Even if it's like a 12-hour train, it's still a option that you have as opposed to the 2-hour flight, which isn't necessarily the case in all of the US. There are certain rail routes across the country, but there aren't quite as many as there are in the European Union, because high-speed rail is just a much more common thing, at least in Western Europe, than it is in the US. So I'll warn you, by the way, pretty much all these points are going to be competition. So if you don't believe competition is an important factor, then I guess you probably won't care, because the next point here is to do with competition on these actual routes themselves. So bear in mind, any route in the EU can be taken up by any airline as long as they can get the slots. And although that realistically means you won't see carriers, the ultra low cost carriers, take up these crazy cheap flights on business massive routes between, let's say, London Heathrow, the first biggest airport in Europe, to Frankfurt International, the third biggest airport, you might see, and in fact you do see, I'm pretty sure, flights from London Stansted, one of London's cheaper airports, to Frankfurt Hahn, one of the worst rated low cost airports. But still, despite it being a terrible airport in so many different ways, people are still known to go there. It's still known as being a very big thing, and the reason for that is the airline fare, because as opposed to let's call it like 100 on a traditional carrier going from those giant airports, it is, if we go via the cheap ones, I'm going to look that right now, even if I wanted to go in just a week's time, it is £13 one way and £11 back. I imagine that actually gets significantly cheaper than that. That still seems pretty ludicrous though, like a £24 return fare from two giant cities in Europe to the other, and that is possible because of again, not only the budget airline being able to fly from any place to any other place, but because there are lots of airports, like I just kind of referenced there, between these two cities. So again, Frankfurt I think only has the 2 airports, but Paris has 3, and London has 6, and Oslo has 4. All these European cities have all these airports, which means the number of connection possibilities between them is near endless. And because of this high competition, they have to again fight for these very low prices. And because Ryanair is and EasyJet and Wizz Air and all the other smaller examples, they are these big examples of how you can get a lot of traffic into your airport to go on these flights. It's worth them either making a loss or going right down to the wire to get these, as opposed to a yes city which can just say, okay, we won't have you here. And what can they say in response? Not too much. Whereas again, you can they literally will put airports against each other to get these crazy low airport costs, reducing one of the massive factors from the US right there. So that's 2 of them reduced, plus the competition factor with rail and stuff that causes the price actually to be a bit more flexible and to be more elastic, and something that consumers will actually care about. But that can't be everything, right? Well, like I've been hinting at over and over again here, budget airlines really are a big part of it, because realistically, if you're going to take a flag carrier, a legacy carrier that has the same problems as the US, you can still buy a flight which is just as expensive from London to Paris or London to Turkey or any one of these giant trunk routes, because that's generally seen as business travel, and businesses willing to put up with that, so they can still make money making those giant kind of profits. However, if you are traveling for leisure or tourism, which are the industries which have the more flexible prices, where if you see a price is too high, you won't go, and if you see a price is too low, then you probably will just fly there, which is really the entire basis of this second channel. But yeah, that, or I guess my travel in general. But that if that's something that is the case, as it is in these sectors, these airlines target those people, and that means that they can literally open up routes between airports and just see if demand happens. This is something that the founder of Ryanair has literally said right out loud, that yeah, he just sometimes experiment with routes just to see if people take hold. Sometimes the mere presence of Ryanair being on a route would be enough for people to look up the route, see how cheap the fares are, and start going to that place. So that is why favoring these low-cost airports, literally, they removed the one factor of air travel, which would often can be, the big kind of limiter, which is the destination. There's only a certain number of ways to get there. If they're all expensive, what are you going to do? What if they can change the destination? Which, if they're Ryanair, apparently according to the founder, they literally can, cause people to go to different destinations, which means you can get even cheaper flights to places like Bremen or Stavanger or other cities which, aren't, necessarily massively internationally known. They become more well known through these routes, which then means there's even more incentive for their, these airports to get the low fees, because literally any airport can be a destination in that regard. So, as well as budget airlines being able to lower the costs by lowering the airport fees and all these other non-conditional ones, they also have lower, costs just in general, because they were founded as low-cost carriers. Again, they don't have all these expectations of the ridiculous pensions and the expectations of high service and all that other stuff that adds to the cost of the ticket, indirectly or directly, but they also have the big advantage of having lower costs on their planes. This might sound absurdly counterintuitive, but it actually is true. Budget airlines generally have, more recent planes and newer planes, and you can argue better planes, but they have at least newer planes than legacy cost carrier airlines. This is because, one, they've been around for less time, but two, it actually is cheaper for them to take a plane and to just fly it repeatedly over and over and over again, and this means although you get less time overall out of it, you get more flying hours out of it, and this is something that, again, the budget airlines do to a crazy degree. And not only do they have these crazy young planes, younger planes than most airlines too, but they will also generally only have one or sometimes two, types of plane in their arsenal. So, in the case of Ryanair, 99.75% of their planes are all the exact same Boeing 737, model. In the case of EasyJet and Wizz Air, there are two model types, but they comprise 100% of their fleet by having, just a few, again, newer, airplanes. This means that the maintenance costs on all of these and making everything, happen how it should is a lot cheaper, because you don't have to train on like 6 to 10 to 20 or how many models it would be on a giant airline, because they just have hundreds of these little ones, which also means they negotiate a bulk price on these, because, it's very appealing to Boeing in the case of Ryanair and to Airbus in the case of EasyJet and Wizz Air to negotiate for a bulk hundreds of plane order, which is very beneficial for both sides, and they therefore get a cheaper plane, which reduces the cost even further. So they reduce the cost by reducing the cost, by reducing the costs, and that actually makes a more pleasant experience because the planes are newer and more consistent as a result, which is mind-blowing when you think about it, but that's what they've actually managed to do. So that's the real big kind of match on this. There is competition on every kind of aspect of this, reducing the prices. Then there is actual, segmentation between, business travel and leisure travel to make an ultra hyper competitive market in that regard. And then there is also the fact that there is lots of airports making even the destination a changeable factor. And when you combine all those things together, fares for £3, London to Strasbourg is one example I've seen. Fares for, a single pound, I think from, like certain double, Irish to Irish flights, a single pound for a flight. That's $1.20, I believe, as of speaking right now. Hopefully you'll see the exact point on screen, but regardless of how many cents that is on the dollar, I think the point is still the same, that it is absurdly low cost flights, and this therefore leads to more demand, actually. More demand, the lower cost fares lead more people to go on, which can lead to lower cost fares and so on and so forth. It's a very repeating cycle, and this means that more Europeans actually fly than Americans do, which can then lead to even more savings on that regard. However, the kind of final point on top of just all these reasons why it can be cheaper that makes it cheaper, there is also the fact that just flying in Europe is more convenient. So as well as having, less delays, as well as having, less pains on either side with the, thing, because again, within the Schengen area at least, there is no passport checks, but even outside of that, it's literally, again, I'm from the UK, I'm outside the Schengen area, and maybe outside the European Union soon, but as well as, but being both those things, you just have to show your passport, they look at it, they go through, it's faster, more convenient, and there's all these other sorts of things. The European security is easy to go through, and also, generally speaking, European airlines use a point-to-point model, which means that you just fly directly from one place to another, no stop in between, which means flying is just more convenient in every aspect, which then drives demand even more, and something prices down, and that is the reason why, even though the European Union and the United States might look kind of similar on paper, they might seem like they should have pretty similar air markets. Truth be told, the European average flight is a significantly lower amount, again, an order of magnitude lower than that of the US, for all the reasons I just covered in today's video. Hopefully you did all enjoy it. This was a lot longer than I was expecting it to be. If you did all like the video, then guess what? Second channel, don't care, goodbye.